What was supposed to be a quiet dinner took an unexpected turn when a CEO, dining undercover at his own restaurant, witnessed something shocking. A well-dressed African-American customer was humiliated right before his eyes. The waiter's words? Disrespectful. His tone? Drenched in arrogance. But what the server didn't know was that the man watching from the corner had the power to change everything. And he wasn't about to stay silent. The evening air in New York was crisp, the kind that made the city's lights seem sharper, more alive. On the corner of an upscale boulevard, La Lumiere stood like a jewel, its golden glow spilling onto the sidewalk, welcoming only those who knew its reputation. Inside, the atmosphere was a quiet hum of elegance. Crystal chandeliers shimmered over neatly set tables, the clinking of fine china blending with the hushed conversations of well-dressed patrons. This was not a place where mistakes were made, nor where the unexpected happened. At a table near the back, a man in his late 50s sat alone, sipping a deep red Bordeaux. His tailored charcoal suit, the subtle gold cufflinks, and the quiet confidence in the way he observed the room suggested someone accustomed to power. To anyone watching, he was just another businessman enjoying a solitary meal. No one knew he was the owner of La Lumiere itself. He preferred it that way. It allowed him to see things as they truly were, without the pretense that came with his title. Then the front doors swung open, and something shifted. A man, well-dressed but unfamiliar to the staff, stepped inside, his neatly pressed navy blue blazer, the polished leather shoes, everything about him spoke of sophistication. Yet, the moment he entered, a subtle tension crackled through the room. Some glanced at him briefly before turning back to their meals. Others, mainly the waitstaff, exchanged looks. The man hesitated only for a second before making his way toward the maitre d'. His posture was poised, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something that had seen moments like this before. From his seat, the CEO noted it all. The small hesitation from the host, the slight stiffening of a waiter near the entrance, the almost imperceptible flicker of discomfort passing through the room. A waiter approached, tall, with a practiced air of hospitality. But there was something off. His name tag read, Daniel. The warmth he had extended to other guests moments before was gone, replaced with something colder. Can I help you? His voice carried no warmth, just the thinly veiled edge of disinterest. Yes, I have a reservation, the man replied, his tone even. He gave his name, which the maitre d' found on the list with no difficulty. Yet, instead of the usual welcoming gesture, there was hesitation. Right this way, Daniel finally said, leading the guest toward a table at the farthest corner of the restaurant. Not along the windows, not in the center of the action, but in the shadows, an unspoken message in the seating choice. The CEO leaned back, swirling his wine slowly. He had seen this before, too many times, but he wanted to see how far it would go. The man took his seat, placing his napkin on his lap, scanning the menu with ease. It was a place of fine dining, where prices were listed without dollar signs, an unstated rule that those dining here did not need to ask. Daniel returned, expression neutral. Are you ready to order? Yes, the man said, closing the menu. I'll have the Wagyu ribeye, medium rare, and a bottle of the Chateau Margaux 2015. Daniel didn't write it down. Instead, he smirked slightly, as if amused. That's one of our most expensive bottles, he said, his voice laced with something unspoken. Then, with the same smirk, are you sure? For the first time, the guest's expression flickered, not anger, not shock, just something weary, as if he had been down this road before. Is there a reason I wouldn't be? He asked calmly. Daniel let out a short breath, shaking his head. No, sir, just making sure. He walked away before waiting for a reply. The CEO watched closely. Daniel stopped at the bar, said something to another waiter, and both chuckled before glancing back. The CEO felt the familiar weight of disappointment settle in his chest. Minutes passed, but no wine came, no steak was prepared. The man at the table noticed, of course, but he did not call for attention. He simply waited, and waited. The CEO set down his glass. That was enough. After another long moment, the guest exhaled slowly, placed his napkin on the table, and stood. He met Daniel's gaze as he passed. But the waiter didn't say a word. No apology, no acknowledgement, and then he was gone. Daniel smirked, shaking his head as if he had just done the restaurant a favor. The CEO remained seated, fingers drumming against the stem of his wine glass. He had come here tonight expecting a routine evening. Instead, he had found a problem. And problems, in his world, required solutions. The city had settled into its quiet rhythm by the time he arrived home. The large windows of his apartment framed a skyline that flickered with life. But his mind was elsewhere. He set his phone on the marble counter, loosened his tie, and poured himself a drink. It wasn't about the wine, nor the restaurant itself. It was about what he had seen, what he had heard, the look in that man's eyes before he left, the smug satisfaction on the waiter's face. It was a pattern, one he had spent years recognizing in boardrooms, negotiations, and now, apparently, in his own business. He took a slow sip, then reached for his laptop. La Lumiere prided itself on customer service. And every piece of feedback, every comment, complaint, or compliment, was recorded. He had barely started scrolling before something caught his eye. A review from 3 months ago. Great food, but the service left a lot to be desired. My husband and I felt unwelcome the moment we stepped in. Our server barely acknowledged us. And we waited over 20 minutes for a simple glass of water. Won't be returning. Then another. Disappointed, we were seated in the back corner, away from everyone else, and our server seemed annoyed by our presence. It was subtle, but unmistakable. If you're not the right kind of guest, you'll feel it. And another. Rude service, slow response time, and dismissive attitude. It's 2024. This kind of thing shouldn't still be happening. His eyes narrowed. He clicked on the filters, refining the search to only include negative reviews regarding service. The pattern was undeniable. Complaints of indifference, rudeness, unnecessary delays, all tied to a handful of specific dates. Different guests, but the same underlying tone. His fingers moved over the keyboard with precision, pulling up the employee schedule for those nights. One name appeared over and over. Daniel. He reached for his phone and dialed. The call was answered after a few rings. Didn't expect to hear from you this late. The voice on the other end said, light but cautious. I have a question, he replied, skipping pleasantries. Have there been any formal complaints about a waiter named Daniel? A pause, then a careful, not that I'm aware of. He knew evasion when he heard it. I'd like you to check. I will, but, now. A longer silence, then a quiet sigh. Give me a moment. He waited, listening to the faint sound of typing on the other end. When the voice returned, it was measured. There were a few complaints. The manager admitted, mostly minor. Guests saying he was inattentive. That kind of thing. And how were they handled? Verbal warnings. Nothing written up. That told him everything he needed to know. Send me the details, he said, his voice even. Every complaint, every response, every time his name was mentioned. Is something wrong? He could have said yes. Instead, he simply ended the call. Minutes later, his inbox chimed. The complaints were there, but they were sparse, carefully written to downplay the issue. And then he saw it. Timestamps from their internal system. Some complaints had been edited after submission. Others had been deleted. Someone had been covering for him. His jaw tightened. He accessed the security feed archives. Going back 6 months, cross-referencing the dates of the complaints. The footage loaded, grainy in some areas but clear where it needed to be. And there it was, Daniel, serving a table with forced politeness. His expression tight, his tone clipped. Then, seconds later, at another table, smiling, laughing, engaged. Different guests, different treatment. He clicked forward. A different night, the same story. A hesitation before seating a couple in the back. A delay in taking their order. The slight shift in body language. The kind that spoke volumes to those who knew how to read it. And yet, somehow, this had never been addressed. His fingers tapped against the desk. A slow rhythm of calculation. He could fire Daniel immediately. That was the obvious move. The easiest solution. But it wouldn't tell him what he really needed to know. It wouldn't show him how deep this went. Or who else had let it continue. He reached for his phone again. This time, the call was brief. A dinner reservation was made. Not for himself. A friend of his, a man with a keen sense of observation and a sharp legal mind, would be dining at La Lumiere next week. He would sit at a table, order a meal, and wait. And Daniel, unaware, would do what he always did. A week later, the restaurant was just as polished, just as refined as ever. From the outside, nothing had changed. The golden glow of La Lumiere still bathed the sidewalk, casting an inviting warmth that masked the cold undercurrent running beneath its surface. The maitre d' still greeted guests with effortless charm. The servers moved with precision, and the wine list remained one of the most exclusive in the city. But tonight, something was different. At a quiet corner table, near the edge of the dining room, the CEO sat with a glass of water, flipping through the menu as if he were just another guest. Gone was the tailored suit, replaced with something understated, a navy blazer, an open-collared shirt. To any outsider, he was simply a businessman unwinding after a long day. He had no reservations, no special treatment, no whispers trailing him. That was the way he wanted it. A few tables away, another man had just taken his seat. Tall, well-dressed, his presence carried a quiet authority. His movements were deliberate, his expression unreadable. He unfolded his napkin, glancing briefly at his surroundings before turning his attention to the menu. The CEO didn't need to watch too closely. He already knew what would happen. Daniel, the same waiter from last week, approached with the same detached expression. No warm greeting, no casual pleasantries, just the bare minimum. "Good evening," Daniel said flatly, setting down a menu. "Can I get you started with something to drink?" The man glanced up. "I'll have a glass of the house red." Daniel nodded without writing anything down. "I'll be back." He turned, but before taking a step, the guest added, "Actually, bring me the Chateau Margaux 2015. Daniel froze for half a second. Then he turned back, brows slightly raised. "That's a high-end bottle," he said, his voice light, but carrying the same edge of condescension the CEO had heard before. "Are you sure?" Across the room, the CEO's fingers tightened slightly around his glass. The man at the table, his friend, a highly respected attorney, did not react right away. He simply held Daniel's gaze for a beat longer than necessary, then gave a slow nod. "Yes," he said evenly, "I'm sure." Daniel let out a short exhale, forced a smile, and disappeared toward the bar. The CEO shifted his gaze. A few minutes later, another table, another request for the same wine. This time, the guest, a white man in his 40s, received no hesitation. No second guessing, just a pleasant nod and a quick, "Great choice, sir." It was happening again. He kept watching. The pattern was there, woven into every interaction. Short responses, delayed service, the subtle but unmistakable difference in the way Daniel carried himself depending on the guest. His friend, patient as ever, continued with the meal. When the wine finally arrived, it was poured without comment. The attorney swirled it, took a sip, then placed the glass down without expression. The service remained cold, impersonal, dismissive. And then came the test. "Would it be possible to move tables?" he asked casually. "This one's a little too bright for me." Daniel didn't even glance around. "Sorry, we can't accommodate that," he said, already reaching for his notepad. A minute later, across the restaurant, another guest made the same request. A different response. "Of course, sir. Let me take care of that for you right away." The CEO leaned back, exhaling through his nose. It was one thing to suspect. It was another to see it unfold in real time. And he wasn't the only one watching. From a nearby table, a man who had been sitting quietly finally spoke up. His voice was low, just enough for the CEO to hear. "This isn't new," the man murmured. The CEO turned slightly, meeting the stranger's gaze. He was older, maybe late 60s, with a weathered face and sharp eyes. "I worked here years ago," the man continued. "People complained, but management never did anything about it." The CEO studied him, his expression unreadable. "They told us to ignore it," the man added, said it wasn't worth the trouble. A silence stretched between them. Then, the CEO gave a single nod. He had heard enough. By the time his friend finished his meal, the decision had already been made. Outside the restaurant, the two men stood beneath the dim glow of a street lamp. The attorney adjusted his cufflinks, exhaling slowly. Well? The CEO reached into his pocket, pulled out a small, crisp business card, and pressed it into his friend's palm. Are you willing to be a witness? The attorney lifted a brow. Then, after a moment, he nodded. The CEO gave him a firm pat on the shoulder. It's time to clean house. The moment he stepped into his office that night, he was already moving with purpose. The dim city lights outside cast a faint glow against the glass walls. But his focus was entirely on the laptop in front of him. His fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, sending an email with a direct, uncompromising request. Every customer complaint filed against Daniel, every internal note, every record, no omissions, no summaries, raw data only. He didn't have to wait long. Within 15 minutes, a notification chimed. The file was larger than expected. A dense spreadsheet of timestamps, complaint details, and staff responses, or rather, the glaring absence of them. He scrolled through, scanning the dates. It was all there. The complaints, stretching back over a year, each detailing the same pattern. Customers ignored, rude service, delays in orders, hostile interactions, a disturbing number of them from guests who all seemed to share one common trait. And then something even more unsettling. Several complaints had timestamps showing they were edited, altered after being filed. Some had been removed entirely, but the digital trail remained. Whoever had tried to cover this up hadn't been careful enough. His jaw tightened. Someone had been protecting Daniel. The next morning, he was in his office earlier than usual. The restaurant was still closed. The staff yet to arrive. But his presence had already sent a ripple through the few employees who had come in early. They knew something was happening. At exactly 9 a.m., the general manager walked in, a man in his late 40s, wearing a well-pressed suit, his expression carefully composed. He took a seat across from the CEO's desk, offering a polite nod, but there was a hesitation behind his eyes. Before he could speak, the CEO slid the printed reports across the desk. Tell me why there isn't a single formal action taken against Daniel, he said, voice calm but firm. The manager glanced down at the papers, scanning them too quickly to be absorbing the details. We've handled minor complaints as they came in. Nothing escalated to the point of formal discipline. A sharp silence filled the room. Minor? The CEO repeated, leaning back in his chair. Customers repeatedly reporting discrimination, complaints being altered or erased. And you call that minor? The manager shifted. We didn't want to overreact, he said carefully. These kinds of things can be subjective. And who deleted the complaints? The question landed like a stone in the air. The manager blinked. Because I have records, the CEO interrupted. I have logs showing that complaints were removed from our system. Either you were unaware, which makes you incompetent, or you were aware and let it happen, which makes you complicit. Which one is it? The manager exhaled slowly, tapping his fingers against the armrest. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower. Look, I didn't think it was a serious problem. We get all kinds of guests, and some of them misinterpret things. The CEO's expression didn't change. So instead of addressing it, you buried it. The manager hesitated before giving a small nod. We were trying to avoid unnecessary conflict, he admitted. I didn't want to escalate a situation that could be smoothed over. By ignoring it? A long pause. The CEO didn't move, didn't look away. Finally, he leaned forward, his tone cutting through the tension like a blade. Let me be clear, he said. You don't get to decide what's worth addressing and what isn't. You don't get to protect an employee at the expense of our customer's dignity. And you sure as hell don't get to erase evidence to cover your own failures. The manager swallowed, his posture stiff. What are you planning to do? The CEO didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his desk, pulled out another sheet of paper, and slid it across the desk. It was an email, sent late the night before. Anonymous. The manager frowned, then picked it up. As he read, his face paled. The message was simple. Attached was a video clip from the restaurant's security feed. The audio wasn't great, but it was enough. Daniel, standing near the service station, speaking to another server. And then the words, unmistakable, caught clearly by the microphone. They're not the kind of people we want here. If it were up to me, I wouldn't even let them in the door. The room fell into silence. The CEO let the weight of it settle. Then, quietly, tell me again how this was just a misunderstanding. The manager had no response. The CEO exhaled. His decision now cemented. He stood, signaling that the conversation was over. We're having a staff meeting, he said, tonight. Make sure Daniel is there. For the first time that morning, the manager looked genuinely uneasy. What are you planning to do? He asked again. The CEO picked up the email, folded it neatly, and placed it back on his desk. Fix a problem, he said simply, permanently. The restaurant was unusually quiet for this time of day. No background chatter, no clinking of glasses or soft murmur of conversation. Just the steady hum of the overhead lights and the occasional shifting of chairs as employees took their seats. The long dining table at the center of the room, usually reserved for high-profile guests, now served a different purpose. A meeting had been called, one with no prior notice, no explanation. The tension in the air was palpable. Daniel sat near the middle, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Across from him, the restaurant manager, Thomas, maintained a forced look of calm, though his fingers tapped lightly against the table. A few senior staff members sat nearby, exchanging uncertain glances. The HR representative was already flipping through a notepad, waiting, and then the door at the far end of the room opened. The man who stepped in was someone they had all seen before but never acknowledged beyond passing glances. Dressed sharply but without excess, he carried himself with an ease that suggested familiarity. Yet there was something in his eyes, an intensity that made the room shift ever so slightly. For years, he had chosen to remain in the background, observing, listening. That was over now. He walked to the head of the table and rested both hands on the chair in front of him. He didn't sit. He let the silence linger, just long enough for the weight of the moment to settle over them. Do you know why we're here? He asked, his voice even, unhurried. There was a beat of hesitation. Thomas cleared his throat first. I assume this is about service standards, he said, offering a practiced smile. We've been meaning to have a discussion on improving. The CEO tilted his head slightly, cutting him off with nothing more than a glance. No, he said simply. This isn't about service standards. Daniel shifted in his seat. The CEO straightened, reaching into the folder he had brought with him. He pulled out a remote control, pressed a button, and a screen behind him flickered to life. A grainy security feed played. The footage was from a week ago. Daniel at a table, arms folded, an uninterested look on his face as he took an order. The timestamp in the corner marked the moment precisely. Then, just a few seconds later, another guest at another table, a different server, a different level of warmth. The contrast was unmistakable. Then another clip. This time, it was the kitchen, a conversation caught by the background microphone. The words weren't loud, but they were clear. A silence fell over the room. A few of the staff members glanced toward Daniel, their expressions tightening. Some looked away. Daniel leaned back in his chair, arms still crossed, but his jaw tensed. Thomas, beside him, let out a slow breath. I wasn't aware of that recording, he said, voice carefully measured. We'll address this internally, of course. But I don't believe this represents. The CEO pressed another button. A new screen appeared, this time showing a series of customer complaint logs. The names had been blurred for privacy, but the details remained. Line after line of complaints. Service delays, rude responses, guests seated in the least desirable sections. And then, a second version of the same document. This one had entire entries missing. Do you recognize these? The CEO asked, glancing at Thomas. The manager hesitated. Those are service notes. Adjustments made for clarity. They're deletions. The CEO corrected. Intentional ones. The tension in the room thickened. The CEO turned to Daniel. Do you have anything to say for yourself? Daniel scoffed, finally uncrossing his arms. I don't have anything against anyone, he said. I just follow the standards. If some people get different service, maybe there's a reason for that. A flicker of something passed through the CEO's eyes. He didn't react immediately. Instead, he let the words hang in the air. Then, quietly, and what reason would that be? Daniel opened his mouth, then shut it again. The CEO looked back at Thomas. And you? The manager shifted in his chair. I was trying to protect the restaurant's reputation. He admitted. I didn't think these complaints needed to be escalated. We wanted to handle things quietly. The CEO exhaled slowly, as if weighing his next words carefully. So let me get this straight. He said, you ignored repeated complaints. You deleted records. And when confronted with evidence, your defense is that you didn't think it was important? No one answered. He nodded once, as if that told him everything he needed to know. Then, with calm finality, he said, Daniel, you are suspended immediately, pending further investigation. Daniel's face hardened. That's ridiculous. You're going to ruin a man's career over this? The CEO didn't blink. Thomas, you have 24 hours to submit a formal explanation for your role in this. I expect it in writing. The manager swallowed. The CEO looked around the room, making sure every single person understood. This is not how we run things. He said, not anymore. Then, with the same quiet authority, he turned and walked out, leaving behind a silence heavier than anything spoken in that room. By the time the meeting ended, the news had already begun to spread. Whispers moved through the staff like wildfire. From the kitchen to the dining floor, out to the valet station where the last of the evening's guests were leaving. Some employees exchanged uneasy glances, while others murmured in hushed tones about what had just happened. The restaurant had always been a well-oiled machine, predictable in its routines, but tonight had shattered that illusion. Some staff members, especially the younger ones, those who had grown tired of the old ways, felt a quiet sense of relief. Others, particularly those who had been working under Thomas for years, viewed the situation differently. To them, it wasn't about fairness or change, it was about loyalty. And the fact that their manager had been publicly called out left them feeling uneasy. Daniel, on the other hand, was seething. He stormed into the back hallway, pushing through the swinging door into the kitchen, where Thomas was already waiting. The manager leaned against the counter, his usual air of control now laced with tension. This is a disaster, Daniel hissed, keeping his voice low. He just humiliated both of us in front of the entire staff. Thomas exhaled, rubbing his temple. Keep your voice down. Daniel stepped closer, his jaw clenched. We can't just let him do this. If I go down, you're going down too, and you know it. The manager finally looked at him, his expression tight. There was no denying the truth in Daniel's words. He had protected him for too long, smoothed over too many complaints. And now, he was next in line for scrutiny. We're not done yet, Thomas muttered. Daniel narrowed his eyes. What do you mean? The manager checked over his shoulder, making sure no one was nearby, then lowered his voice. I have a contact in the media. Someone who owes me a favor. Daniel's lips curled into a slow smirk. You're going to make this public? Thomas nodded. Not just public. We're going to turn it against him. Without another word, he pulled out his phone and stepped out the back door into the alley. The number was already saved. After a few rings, a voice answered. Thomas kept his tone measured, steady, as if this was nothing more than business as usual. I have a story for you, he said, something that's going to shake up the restaurant industry. The voice on the other end sounded intrigued. Go on. The new CEO of La Lumiere, Thomas continued. He's staging a power grab, firing loyal employees to bring in his own people, and he's using the media to create a fake scandal to justify it. There was a pause. Then, do you have proof? Thomas smirked. I can provide names, records, internal messages. Give me a day, and I'll have everything you need. Send what you have, the journalist said. If it checks out, we'll run it. Thomas ended the call, slipping his phone back into his pocket. He turned to Daniel, who was watching him with quiet satisfaction. By the time this hits the press, Thomas said, he won't be the one in control anymore. The next morning, the headline was impossible to miss. It ran on one of the city's most notorious online news sites, the kind that thrived on scandal and controversy. The article painted the CEO as a ruthless corporate figure, someone who had swooped in under the guise of reform but was really just clearing out longtime employees to push his own agenda. Anonymous sources, undoubtedly fed by Thomas, claimed that the recent firings and suspensions were part of a calculated move to reshape the company in his image. The piece questioned whether the discrimination scandal had been exaggerated, if not outright fabricated. The story spread fast. By noon, a few shareholders had already sent cautious inquiries. Some employees, those who had remained neutral, started questioning their own opinions. And outside the restaurant, a small group of former staff members gathered, talking in hushed, bitter voices. But the CEO was calm. In his office, he leaned back in his chair, skimming the article with no trace of surprise. He had expected this. He had seen men like Thomas before, men who, when cornered, chose to set fire to everything around them rather than face the consequences of their actions. A quiet knock at the door. He glanced up as his attorney stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I assume you've seen the article," the lawyer said, setting his briefcase on the desk. The CEO nodded. "I read it this morning." The lawyer studied him for a moment. "You don't seem particularly concerned." The CEO smirked. "I'm not." His lawyer raised a brow. "And why is that?" The CEO reached into his drawer, pulling out a folder. He slid it across the desk. "Because we're going to fight fire with fire." The lawyer opened it, scanning the contents. Inside were documents, timestamps, and internal messages, the real records, not the manipulated version Thomas had given to the press. "This," the CEO said, "is the truth." His lawyer let out a low whistle. "You want to take this public?" The CEO nodded. "But not yet. Let Thomas think he's winning. Let him believe the momentum is in his favor." He leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "And then, when the time is right, we end this." By noon, the headline was everywhere. The article had spread across social media like wildfire, circulating in business forums and hospitality networks. A few industry insiders had already begun weighing in, some skeptical, others intrigued. The title alone was enough to stir controversy. New CEO of La Lumiere purging loyal staff to install his own team? The piece was carefully crafted, laced with just enough truth to make the accusations seem plausible. It painted the CEO as an opportunist, someone who had taken advantage of a minor issue and blown it out of proportion to justify restructuring the company. Anonymous sources, undoubtedly planted by Thomas, claimed that long-term employees had been forced out, that the so-called discrimination scandal was exaggerated, perhaps even fabricated. The writer, known for his sharp commentary on corporate shake-ups, framed the story as a power struggle rather than an ethical correction. The reactions were instant. Some readers called for a boycott, accusing the CEO of manipulating the situation for personal gain. Others defended him, pointing out that companies needed reform when toxic behavior went unchecked. But in the sea of opinions, one thing was clear: this was no longer just a restaurant dispute. It had become a public spectacle. The CEO sat in his office, watching as the comments rolled in. He wasn't surprised. He had expected Thomas to make a move, and this was exactly the kind of attack he had anticipated. The question now was how to respond. His attorney sat across from him, phone in hand, scrolling through the latest coverage. "If you make a statement now, you'll just be playing into their hands," the lawyer said. "They want you to react emotionally. If you do, it'll turn into a debate instead of a clear-cut truth." The CEO leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. "Then we don't respond," he said. "Not yet." The lawyer nodded. "Not until we have something undeniable." The CEO turned to his assistant. "Get IT on this. I want to know where that leak came from." An hour later, the answer arrived. A junior analyst from the internal security team knocked hesitantly before stepping inside. He placed a folder on the desk, glancing nervously between the CEO and the attorney. "We traced the email that tipped off the journalist," he said. "It was sent from an anonymous account, but the metadata gave it away." He hesitated. The CEO met his eyes. "Who was it?" The analyst exhaled. "Thomas." There was a long silence. The lawyer let out a low whistle. The CEO didn't look surprised. If anything, there was the faintest flicker of amusement in his eyes. "He really thought that would work," he murmured. The lawyer leaned forward. "What's your move?" The CEO closed the folder. "We go to war." That afternoon, he made 2 phone calls. The first was to a journalist, not one who thrived on sensationalism, but someone with credibility, someone who valued facts over drama. The second was to the legal team, By the evening, the CEO had arranged a private press briefing. It was invitation only, with only the most respected members of the media present. No leaks, no distractions, just the truth. As the reporters arrived, they found an unassuming setup, no stage, no grand declarations, just a conference table, a projector, and a handful of documents waiting to be revealed. The CEO stood at the front of the room, calm and composed. There have been a lot of stories in the past 24 hours. He began, some of them based on speculation, some outright falsehoods. Tonight, we're here for one reason, to separate fact from fiction. He clicked a button on the remote, and the screen behind him lit up. First, security footage, the same recordings he had shown in the internal meeting. The interactions, the dismissive tone, the quiet acts of discrimination that had gone unchecked for too long. The room was silent as the clips played. Then, the next piece of evidence, customer complaints. Not just from recent weeks, but stretching back over a year. Unedited, unaltered. Some of them had never been made public before. Buried under Thomas's management. Then came the final blow, a recording. A former employee, one who had worked under Thomas, had reached out anonymously. His voice played over the speakers. Raw and unfiltered. I tried to report it. I went to management. I filed complaints. They told me to let it go. Said it wasn't worth the trouble. The murmurs in the room grew louder. Some reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads. Others exchanged glances. The weight of the evidence was undeniable. The CEO let the silence settle before speaking again. This isn't about restructuring, he said. It's about integrity. About whether a business should stand for something, or whether it should ignore problems for the sake of convenience. He gestured toward the documents in front of them. These are open for review. Any of you can verify them. What you do with this information is up to you. The briefing ended without theatrics. No scripted lines, no PR spin, just facts. And that was enough. By the next morning, a new article had surfaced. The original scandal had been flipped on its head. The focus was no longer on the CEO's so-called power grab, it was on Thomas. On the cover-ups, on the systemic failures that had allowed discrimination to thrive. Public opinion shifted. Not completely. There would always be those who resisted change, but the narrative was no longer in Thomas's control. And Thomas knew it, as he sat in his office, reading the latest headlines, his hands clenched into fists. He had played his best card, and it hadn't been enough. But he wasn't done yet. Thomas knew his time was running out. The walls were closing in, and the story he had tried to spin had crumbled faster than he expected. The press had turned against him. The internal investigations had exposed his actions. And now, the only thing standing between him and total disgrace was one last move. He needed leverage, and he knew exactly where to find it. That afternoon, he walked into a private lounge at an exclusive members-only club in Manhattan. The scent of aged whiskey and expensive cigars filled the air as he scanned the room. At a corner table, sipping a neat scotch, sat Henry Langston, one of La Lumiere's largest shareholders. A man who cared far less about ethics and far more about the bottom line. Thomas took a steadying breath and approached. Langston glanced up, unimpressed. I was wondering when you'd come knocking, he said, swirling his drink. Thomas pulled out a chair and sat across from him. I assume you've been following the news. Langston smirked. Hard to miss. Quite the mess you're in. Thomas leaned forward. It's not just my mess. This affects La Lumiere. The brand is being dragged through the mud. The CEO is making reckless decisions. And if he's not stopped, he's going to destroy everything we built. Langston raised a brow. We? Thomas gritted his teeth but forced a smile. You and I both know the strength of this restaurant was always in its reputation. And right now, that reputation is at risk. Investors are nervous. Customers are divided. You can't tell me you're comfortable with that. Langston took a sip of his drink. Considering. And what exactly do you want from me? I need the board to act. Thomas said. We push for an emergency vote. If enough pressure is applied, we can force him to step down before this escalates any further. Langston chuckled. You're asking me to back a coup? I'm asking you to protect your investment. Thomas corrected. Think about it. What happens when this so-called reform scares off our high-profile clientele? When the media stops talking about ethics and starts talking about declining profits. Langston tapped his fingers against the glass, weighing the argument. Finally, he exhaled. You better hope you're right about this, he said, because if you fail, you won't just lose your job. You'll be done in this industry. Thomas didn't flinch. I won't fail. That evening, the board received a formal request for an emergency meeting. The next morning, they convened in a private conference room overlooking the city skyline. The tension in the air was thick as the shareholders took their seats, some glancing at their phones, already aware of the controversy swirling around the company. The CEO arrived last, composed as ever, stepping into the room with measured confidence. Langston was the first to speak. We're here because certain members of this board have concerns, he said, concerns that this recent scandal has done more harm than good. The CEO folded his hands on the table. Go on. Thomas sat up straighter, feigning an air of reluctant professionalism. With all due respect, this situation has created unnecessary instability, he said. There are those who feel your handling of this issue has been excessive. That instead of resolving the matter discreetly, you've inflamed tensions and jeopardized our reputation. A murmur of agreement rippled through a few members. Langston leaned forward. What do you say to the fact that this has already cost us business? That some of our long-standing clients have quietly taken their money elsewhere? The CEO met his gaze without hesitation. I'd say you're looking at the wrong numbers. A pause. Without breaking eye contact, he reached into his folder and slid a report across the table. This is the latest financial data, he said, not from speculation, not from panicked investors, but from actual customer engagement. The board members leaned in, skimming the document. The numbers were clear, despite the controversy. Online reservations had spiked, foot traffic had increased. More importantly, customer feedback from new guests was overwhelmingly positive. Then, the second document, a staff survey. Over 80% of employees had expressed their support for policy changes aimed at ensuring fairness. This isn't just about fixing a problem, the CEO said. It's about rebuilding something stronger. Langston frowned, but he was reading the numbers carefully now, his skepticism shifting to contemplation. Thomas, sensing control slipping, tried one last desperate move. That's all well and good, he said, but how long before this wave of goodwill fades? What happens when the controversy dies down and all that's left are the burned bridges? The CEO finally turned to him. I think we should ask a different question, he said. What happens if we don't change? A silence settled over the room. Then, the door opened, and the company's lead counsel entered, carrying a folder. Apologies for the interruption, she said, setting it on the table. The CEO flipped it open and scanned the first page. A small smile touched his lips. He looked up. This is Thomas's employment contract, he said, specifically, the section that prohibits management from manipulating internal policies to suppress employee or customer concerns. Thomas's face paled. The CEO leaned back. And this, he continued, holding up another sheet, is the documented proof that you altered records to hide discrimination complaints. A sharp intake of breath echoed from one of the board members. Langston exhaled slowly. Is this true? He asked, looking at Thomas. Thomas swallowed hard, but no words came. The CEO closed the folder. The contract states that such an action is grounds for immediate termination. No one spoke. Then, Langston nodded once. Effective immediately. The decision was final. Thomas's hands clenched into fists, his jaw tight, but he knew there was no way out. Slowly, stiffly, he pushed back his chair and stood. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. Just before he exited, the CEO spoke again. La Lumiere isn't just a restaurant, he said, his voice calm but firm. It's a place where everyone deserves respect. That won't change. Thomas hesitated for the briefest moment. Then, without looking back, he left. The battle had been won. But the fight wasn't over yet. The fallout from the board meeting was immediate. With Thomas officially terminated, a sense of unease lingered in the air. Some employees were relieved, even hopeful, seeing it as a long overdue change. Others, particularly those who had aligned themselves with him, weren't so sure. They muttered in corners, exchanged wary glances, and speculated about what would come next. But outside the restaurant, the storm hadn't settled. The scandal had left a mark. And despite the CEO's strategic handling of the media, some longtime patrons remained hesitant. Reservations had dipped slightly, and a few loyal customers had quietly canceled upcoming bookings. Le Lumiere wasn't in crisis. Not yet, but the damage was undeniable. If something wasn't done soon, the reputation they had spent years building would erode. The CEO wasn't about to let that happen. That afternoon, he called for an internal leadership meeting. The core management team, department heads, senior kitchen staff, and the few remaining trusted executives gathered in the restaurant's private dining room. The table was usually reserved for high-profile guests, but tonight, it served a different purpose. As they settled in, the CEO stood at the head of the table, hands resting lightly on the polished wood. His gaze moved across the room, meeting each person's eyes before he spoke. "We all know what happened here," he said, his voice steady, "and we know that change is never easy. But this isn't about one scandal or one person. It's about what kind of business we want to be." A quiet murmur passed through the room. Some nodded, others shifted in their seats, uncertain. "We're making changes," he continued, "and not just surface-level ones. Real changes." He outlined the plan. First, every employee, regardless of position, would undergo new training focused on service standards and workplace respect. There would be no exceptions. Second, the hiring process would be revised to ensure a more diverse and inclusive workforce, setting a new precedent for the industry. And third, an anonymous reporting system would be introduced, allowing employees to safely report unethical behavior without fear of retaliation. Silence followed. Then, one of the senior managers, a woman who had been with Le Lumiere for over a decade, cleared her throat. "This is a lot," she admitted. "Some of us have been here for years. This isn't how things have been done before." The CEO nodded. "And that's exactly the problem." A few staff members exchanged glances. Some looked thoughtful, others remained guarded. One of the younger supervisors spoke next. "I think this is the right move," he said carefully, "but not everyone will see it that way." The CEO knew he was right. Even as some employees embraced the change, a quieter, more resistant group remained. They weren't openly hostile, not yet, but there was an undercurrent of pushback. These were the people who had worked closely with Thomas. The ones who had turned a blind eye to discrimination because it was easier than standing against it. He didn't have to wait long to see their next move. The first sign came later that evening. An anonymous email, sent through the internal staff network, began circulating. The message was brief but pointed. "The new CEO is forcing his politics into the workplace, turning Le Lumiere into a battlefield instead of a restaurant. If we don't push back, soon there won't be anything left of the place we built." By morning, the effects had begun to spread. A handful of veteran staff members, servers, kitchen assistants, and a couple of longtime bartenders had started whispering in hushed tones, their skepticism turning into quiet resistance. They weren't outright defiant, not yet, but their discontent was growing. And the CEO knew that if he didn't act quickly, the fractures in his workforce would only deepen. That afternoon, a familiar knock came at his office door. It was one of the younger employees. Someone who had been at Le Lumiere just long enough to see what had been happening but not long enough to be part of the old guard. The CEO gestured for him to enter. "Something on your mind?" The employee hesitated before speaking. "You should know, some people aren't happy about the changes." The CEO exhaled. "I figured as much. There's more," the employee said, lowering his voice. "That email? It wasn't just some random complaint. There are people here, people who were close to Thomas, who don't want you to succeed. They think if they fight hard enough, they can make this go away." The CEO leaned back, fingers tapping lightly against his desk. He had expected resistance, but this was something else entirely. "Do you know who sent the email?" he asked. The employee hesitated, then nodded. "I have an idea." The CEO considered for a long moment. "Thank you for telling me," he said finally. The employee gave a small nod and left, leaving the CEO alone with his thoughts. The battle wasn't over. Someone was still pulling strings in the background, trying to turn his own employees against him. And if he didn't put an end to it now, It could unravel everything. He wasn't going to let that happen. The email had been a mistake. Not because of its message. There were always going to be those who resisted change, but because it had left a trail. And the CEO had every intention of following it. Late that night, long after the last guests had left and the restaurant had gone quiet, he sat in his office, staring at the screen as his IT team's report loaded. It didn't take long. The sender had used a VPN, but not well enough. The digital breadcrumbs led straight to someone inside La Lumiere. Not just anyone, but a longtime employee, one who had worked closely with Thomas for years. Someone who had benefited from the old way of doing things. The CEO exhaled slowly, fingers tapping against the desk. He had expected resistance. He had expected backlash. But this was coordinated. And it wasn't over yet. The next morning, the restaurant was tense. Conversations hushed when certain people walked by. Groups formed in corners, speaking in low voices. The divide was growing, and soon, it would break open. The CEO didn't have to wait long. That afternoon, a meeting had already been scheduled, a follow-up with key staff to discuss the new policies. But as soon as he stepped into the room, he could feel it, the shift. A group of veteran employees, most of them senior servers and managers who had been with La Lumiere for years, sat together. Their expressions weren't just skeptical. They were defiant. One of them, a man in his late 50s with graying hair and a stiff posture, stood up as soon as the CEO took his seat. "This needs to stop," the man said, voice steady. "We've all had enough of these changes." The CEO studied him. He recognized him, one of the restaurant's longest-serving floor managers. Someone who had been there when Thomas was still in control. "And by these changes," the CEO said slowly, "you mean holding employees accountable for their actions?" The man's jaw tightened. "I mean dismantling everything we've built here. This restaurant was founded on tradition, on respect for its senior staff. Now you're tearing it apart." A murmur of agreement rose from the group behind him. The CEO leaned back. "I see," he said. "And tell me, which traditions are we talking about? The ones where employees could discriminate against customers without consequences? The ones where complaints were buried to protect the wrong people?" The room was silent. Then, another voice, this time from a younger employee sitting on the other side of the table. "Maybe that's the problem," she said. "Maybe the traditions weren't as great as we thought." The CEO's eyes flickered toward her. He hadn't expected anyone to speak up. "Not yet." The manager scoffed. "You wouldn't understand," he said. "You haven't been here long enough." The younger employee's jaw tightened. "Maybe that's why I see it for what it really is." A tension thick enough to cut filled the air. The CEO let it settle for a moment before speaking again. "I understand your concerns," he said. "Change is hard. It makes people uncomfortable. But let's be clear about one thing. La Lumiere isn't just about tradition. It's about excellence. And excellence doesn't come from protecting bad behavior." He reached into his folder, pulling out a document and setting it on the table. The room shifted. People leaned in slightly, unsure of what was coming next. "This," the CEO said, tapping the paper, "is a list of unauthorized bonuses and payouts given to certain employees over the past 5 years. Bonuses that didn't come from performance, but from loyalty to Thomas." The manager's face paled. "You see," the CEO continued, "this isn't about protecting tradition. This is about protecting privilege. And now that it's gone, some of you don't know what to do with yourselves." Silence. Then, finally, the CEO straightened. "Let me make this simple," he said. "If you want to be part of what's next, then stay. If you want to keep defending the past, the door is open." No one moved. Then, slowly, one of the senior waiters pushed back his chair and stood. Without a word, he walked toward the door. Another followed. By the time it was over, nearly a dozen employees had left the room. The CEO exhaled. He had expected losses. He had expected resistance. But what mattered was who remained. And those who stayed, they were the ones who would rebuild. The dust had begun to settle inside La Lumiere. The worst of the internal rebellion had been dealt with. Those who opposed the changes had either left or fallen silent. But the CEO knew better than to assume the battle was over. There was always a final push. A desperate move from those who refused to accept defeat. And it came sooner than expected. That morning, his assistant placed a printed article on his desk. The headline was impossible to ignore. Le Lumiere CEO manipulating staff? The cost of social justice is mass unemployment. It wasn't from a reputable news source, but it had spread quickly. A well-known blogger, notorious for exposing corporate scandals, had written an explosive piece, claiming that the CEO had systematically forced out longtime employees under the guise of reform. The article framed him as a ruthless businessman, using diversity initiatives as an excuse to purge the company and reshape it in his own image. The accusations were sharp, laced with just enough distorted truth to make them believable. It painted those who had left as victims, loyal employees thrown aside for the sake of political correctness. The CEO skimmed the article, his expression unreadable. He had expected backlash, but this was calculated. He set the paper down and looked at his assistant. Who fed him this? She hesitated. We're looking into it, but I'd bet on one of the former employees who left last week. Someone still holding a grudge. He exhaled through his nose. And our competitors? They're taking full advantage. A couple of rival restaurants have already started making subtle jabs online, emphasizing their commitment to tradition, which, in this context, is just a way to take a shot at us. The CEO leaned back, fingers steepled. He had two choices. He could ignore it, let the storm pass, trust that the truth would win out in the end, or he could strike back, smartly, surgically. There was no real choice at all. Get the PR team, he said, and get legal. We're not just going to defend ourselves. We're going to turn this around. The first step was information. Within hours, his team compiled data showing that Le Lumiere's customer satisfaction ratings had actually improved since the reforms. Complaints about service had decreased. Employee support for the new policies stood at over 80%. The numbers told a story very different from the one being spun online. The second step was credibility. Rather than responding with a rushed public statement, the CEO reached out to a major news outlet, one with real influence. He agreed to an exclusive sit-down interview, one where he would address the accusations head-on. But on his terms. When the interview aired 2 days later, it was direct and unapologetic. We're not dismantling Le Lumiere, he said. We're rebuilding it, and any business that refuses to evolve will eventually collapse under the weight of its own stagnation. He laid out the facts, clear, undeniable. He spoke about accountability, about the necessity of change, about how protecting toxic behavior for the sake of tradition was never a sustainable model. His words struck a chord. The public reaction was swift and divided. Some continued to push back, unwilling to accept the shift. But many others, customers, industry professionals, even former skeptics, began to voice support. The tide was turning. And then, just as the conversation was reaching a boiling point, something unexpected happened. An anonymous email leaked. This time, it wasn't a baseless accusation. It was a damning piece of evidence. The email, dated nearly a year before the scandal broke, was from Thomas. It contained instructions to senior staff on how to filter customer complaints, specifically, how to suppress reports from minority patrons, ensuring they were either ignored or dismissed as misunderstandings. The moment it hit the internet, everything changed. The same blogger who had written the hit piece was now forced to backpedal, scrambling to address the new revelation. The article lost its momentum. Competitors who had been capitalizing on the controversy suddenly fell silent. And inside Le Lumiere, something even more significant happened. The employee who had leaked the email, someone who had previously stayed quiet, unwilling to pick a side, stepped forward. They had seen enough, and now, they were ready to speak. The CEO met with them personally, listening as they described the pressure they had felt, the fear of retaliation, and in that moment, he knew, this wasn't just about saving Le Lumiere anymore. It was about setting a precedent. By the time the dust settled, the restaurant wasn't just surviving the scandal. It was becoming something more. A symbol of what the industry could be. But the CEO knew there was still one last step to take before this chapter could truly close. The fall of Thomas had been inevitable, but the final blow came with ruthless precision. The leaked email had left no room for debate. The proof of his wrongdoing the suppression of customer complaints, the manipulation of records, the quiet rewards given to those who upheld the old, broken system, was undeniable. And now, it was time to make it official. That morning, in the sleek, glass-paneled boardroom of the parent company that owned Le Lumiere, Thomas sat across from the CEO, flanked by a panel of senior executives. The air in the room was tense, the weight of his impending fate pressing down on his shoulders. The CEO's expression remained calm, almost detached. He had fought this battle for weeks. But there was no need for theatrics now. The facts spoke for themselves. You were given a position of trust, the CEO said, his voice steady, and you abused it. Thomas straightened in his chair, trying to maintain some semblance of dignity. I was protecting the restaurant's reputation, he argued. I did what I thought was necessary to maintain the standards this place was built on. The CEO barely reacted. He simply reached into the folder in front of him and pulled out a document. This, he said, sliding it across the table, is the official record of customer complaints that you personally ordered to be deleted. Thomas's mouth tightened. And this, the CEO continued, placing another sheet in front of him, is the proof that you instructed employees to ignore certain guests based on their background. A murmur passed through the executives seated around the table. Some of them had once supported Thomas, or at least tolerated him. Now, not a single one spoke in his defense. The CEO leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. You didn't just fail this company, he said. You failed the people who trusted you to lead with integrity. Thomas opened his mouth to argue, but the chairman of the board cut him off. The decision is unanimous, the chairman said. You are hereby banned from working in any of our establishments, now or in the future. For the first time, Thomas's composure cracked. He knew what that meant. He wasn't just losing this job, he was being blacklisted. His career in high-end hospitality was over. He clenched his fists, his jaw tightening, but there was nothing left to fight for. Slowly, stiffly, he pushed back his chair and stood. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. As it closed behind him, a sense of finality settled over the room. The war was over. That evening, the CEO stood in the main dining hall of Le Lumiere. The space felt lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted from the very walls. The team that remained, those who had embraced the change, moved with a renewed energy. There was no more tension, no more whispered defiance, but his work wasn't finished. The next morning, he called a press conference. It wasn't just to announce the changes at Le Lumiere. This was bigger than one restaurant. Standing before a sea of reporters, he spoke about accountability, about the lessons learned, about the future of the industry. And then, he made an announcement no one had expected. Using a portion of the restaurant's profits, he would establish a fund to support hospitality workers who had faced discrimination in their workplaces. Employees who had been mistreated, silenced, or overlooked would now have legal and financial support to fight back. Beyond that, Le Lumiere would partner with a human rights organization to create a free training program, one that any restaurant could implement, ensuring that fairness and respect became industry standards, not just corporate buzzwords. This isn't about one restaurant, the CEO said, his voice steady. It's about what we owe to the people who make this industry what it is. We didn't just change Le Lumiere, we're changing the way people treat each other. The applause was immediate, but the CEO barely noticed. His eyes drifted toward the back of the room, where, through the glass doors, he could see the restaurant's sign gleaming under the city lights. Le Lumiere, the light. It had been a long, brutal fight, but standing there, watching his staff work with a renewed sense of purpose, he knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. For a moment, it seemed like everything had finally settled. The restaurant had weathered the storm. The toxic remnants of the old regime had been removed, and Le Lumiere was on a path toward true reinvention. But victories were rarely that simple. Thomas was gone, but he wasn't finished. Even in disgrace, he had one last move to play. That morning, the CEO's assistant entered his office, her face tense. Without a word, she placed a tablet in front of him. The screen displayed a new article, its headline bold and unmistakable. Le Lumiere's CEO, a reformer or a tyrant? The CEO's jaw tightened as he skimmed the piece. The article painted him not as a leader, but as a manipulator. It accused him of orchestrating a power grab, of forcing out longtime employees under the guise of moral reform. It implied that he had used the scandal as a convenient excuse to consolidate control. And worst of all, it wasn't coming from an obvious tabloid. It had been published by a well-known investigative platform, one that prided itself on exposing corporate corruption. The source of the accusations? Anonymous former employees who had, unsurprisingly, been close to Thomas. His assistant shifted uncomfortably. Some board members have already seen it. Of course, they had. It wasn't just an attack on his reputation. It was designed to make the board question their decision to back him. If they lost faith, if enough doubt crept in, they could pressure him to resign. He looked up. Where did this come from? We traced the leaks back to Thomas. She confirmed. He's been in contact with the reporters. And, she hesitated. He exhaled. And, there's more, she admitted. We found a series of wire transfers into his personal account. Large ones. They came from an outside entity. The CEO frowned. Who? She met his gaze. A competitor. The room was silent for a long moment. It made sense. Thomas had lost his position. But he still had connections. And someone, somewhere, had seen an opportunity. If they couldn't bring La Lumiere down directly, they could at least destabilize it from the inside. The CEO leaned back in his chair, fingers pressed together in thought. Thomas had played his last card. Now, it was time to take it away. That afternoon, the board convened. The tension in the room was thick. Some members looked concerned. Others skeptical. A few, those who had been uneasy with the reforms from the beginning, seemed almost eager to hear what he had to say. Langston, the most influential shareholder, folded his arms. You've seen the article, he said. So, tell us, are we looking at another crisis? The CEO didn't flinch. No, he said simply. We're looking at an attempted smear campaign. He placed a file on the table and slid it toward Langston. What's this? Langston asked. Proof, the CEO said. Bank records showing that Thomas received multiple payments from a direct competitor. A ripple of murmurs passed through the board members. Langston opened the file, eyes narrowing as he scanned the documents. The CEO continued. Not only did Thomas leak false information, but he was actively paid to do it. He wasn't just trying to save his own reputation, he was selling his influence to sabotage this company from the outside. Another board member frowned. And you can verify this? The CEO nodded. Legal has already confirmed the transactions. Langston exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. Unbelievable. Another member, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. And what do you propose we do next? The CEO was ready for this. We go public, he said. Langston raised a brow. You want to turn this into an even bigger story? I want to end it. The CEO clarified. Right now, there are people who still believe the accusations. We let the truth sit in the shadows. And it stays a debate. We bring it into the light. And we take control of the narrative. Langston considered this, then slowly nodded. Do it. That evening, the CEO held a press conference. The room was packed, reporters, industry insiders, even a few customers who had come out of curiosity. Cameras flashed as he stepped up to the podium. He didn't waste time. There have been accusations, he began, his voice calm but firm. Accusations that this company's leadership has acted in bad faith. That our reforms were not about integrity, but control. He let the words settle before continuing. But what has not been reported is the truth behind these claims. The screen behind him lit up, displaying the financial records, the evidence of Thomas's payments, the undeniable proof that this whistleblower had, in fact, been bought. A quiet murmur rippled through the crowd. What happened at La Lumiere wasn't a power struggle. The CEO continued. It was a reckoning, and those who profited from the past tried, one last time, to protect their interests. He paused, scanning the room. They failed. A reporter raised a hand. And what happens now? The CEO exhaled slowly. Now, he said, we rebuild, without corruption, without deception, without fear. The next morning, the headlines had changed. Thomas's last gambit had crumbled. And Le Lumiere had won. The air in the conference room was heavy. The press conference had drawn reporters, shareholders, and employees alike, all waiting to see how this final battle would play out. At the center of it all sat the CEO, calm and unwavering, as the screen behind him displayed the evidence that would end this war once and for all. "This is not speculation," the CEO said, his voice steady. "This is proof." On the screen, a series of financial statements appeared, clear documentation of unauthorized wire transfers sent to Thomas's personal account. The payments had come from a direct competitor, a business that had everything to gain from Le Lumiere's downfall. Murmurs rippled through the room, cameras flashing as reporters frantically typed notes. The CEO continued, "We have also obtained statements from employees, those who once remained silent but now refuse to let this lie continue. Their accounts confirm what we already knew. The accusations against Le Lumiere were fabricated, designed to create chaos and force me out." The final piece came next. A voice recording crackled over the speakers, unmistakable in its clarity. It was Thomas himself, speaking in hushed but unmistakable tones. "I don't care what you write, as long as it makes him look like the villain," Thomas was heard saying. "Make it seem like he forced people out. The board won't protect him forever if we make enough noise." A gasp moved through the room. The truth was undeniable now. At the front of the room, Thomas sat stiffly in his chair, his face frozen in shock. His mind raced for an excuse, an explanation, anything that could turn this around. But there was nothing left. "You tried to destroy this company," the CEO said, turning his gaze toward Thomas. "You failed." For the first time, Thomas looked genuinely afraid. A reporter in the crowd raised a hand. "What happens now?" The CEO didn't hesitate. "Legal action has already been taken. Thomas will face charges for corporate sabotage and defamation. But more importantly, Le Lumiere will continue forward, stronger than ever." The board, seated along the far end of the room, exchanged glances. Langston, the most influential among them, nodded in approval. "We stand with you," he said. And with that, the last remnants of the old system crumbled. By the evening, the news had spread everywhere. The false accusations had been dismantled, and Le Lumiere's reputation was not only restored, it was stronger than before. Customers who had once hesitated returned in droves, and new patrons arrived, drawn by the restaurant's commitment to fairness and integrity. That night, standing in his office, the CEO looked out the window. The dining hall below was full, the warm glow of candlelight illuminating the laughter and conversation of people who no longer saw Le Lumiere as just another high-end establishment, but as a symbol of change. He exhaled slowly, letting the weight of the battle finally lift from his shoulders. He had not just saved a restaurant. He had reshaped an industry. The storm had passed, but its impact would be felt for years to come. With Thomas exposed, Le Lumiere began a transformation that went beyond damage control. It was a full-scale restructuring. Policies were rewritten, training programs overhauled, and a culture of accountability established from the ground up. What had once been whispered complaints about discrimination was now a rallying call for change, not just at Le Lumiere, but across the entire industry. The media hailed the CEO as a leader who had taken a stand where so many before him had looked away. Articles praised him not just for restoring Le Lumiere's reputation, but for challenging the very foundation of how high-end restaurants operated. And the ripple effect had begun. Other establishments, some reluctantly, others proudly, started implementing similar training programs. The CEO had unknowingly sparked a movement, one that reached far beyond his restaurant's doors. But while Le Lumiere moved forward, Thomas had nowhere to go but down. It started with an internal investigation, one that quickly uncovered even more financial misconduct. The payments he had received weren't just bribes, they were part of a coordinated effort to undermine Le Lumiere from within. The board filed official charges. Weeks later, he stood before a judge, facing a series of corporate fraud allegations. His lawyers scrambled to argue that he had been unfairly targeted, but the evidence was overwhelming. The verdict? Guilty. A heavy fine was imposed, along with a lifetime ban from working in any business affiliated with Le Lumiere's parent company. His professional reputation was in ruins, his carefully built connections severed overnight, No respectable restaurant would touch him. A former colleague, who had once stood by him, later revealed in a private conversation that Thomas had packed his belongings and left the city, hoping to start over somewhere no one knew his name. But the industry had a long memory, and second chances were rarely granted to those who had burned every bridge behind them. Weeks after the dust had settled, an old but familiar face walked through La Lumiere's doors. The same man who had been humiliated by Thomas that night, the black customer who had unknowingly set everything into motion, stood at the entrance. This time, no one hesitated. A well-dressed maitre d' greeted him with a warm smile, leading him to one of the best tables in the house. Staff moved with precision, treating him not as an exception, but as the valued guest he had always deserved to be. The CEO watched from a distance, allowing the moment to unfold naturally. But as he turned to leave, a deep, steady voice called out, "You." The CEO turned back. The man approached him, studying him for a moment before extending his hand. Most people, he said, his tone firm but measured, would have looked the other way. The CEO clasped his hand in a firm shake. There was no grand speech, no need for excessive words, just a simple, quiet truth. "No one deserves to be treated like that," he said. The man nodded once, as if that was all he needed to hear. Then, with a final glance of acknowledgement, he returned to his seat. Outside, the city was alive with movement. But for the CEO, there was a rare stillness in the air. La Lumiere was no longer just a restaurant. It had become something bigger, a symbol of what could change when people refused to accept the status quo. He had won this battle, but deep down, he knew the fight for fairness and accountability was far from over. And he was ready for whatever came next. 1 month after the storm had passed, La Lumiere stood stronger than ever. The transformation was no longer just a promise, it was measurable. Sales had climbed back to their pre-scandal numbers, with many customers actively supporting the restaurant for its stand against discrimination. Online reviews shifted from skepticism to praise, highlighting not just the quality of the food but the fairness of the service. Internally, the change was even more profound. An internal survey revealed that 92% of employees now felt respected and valued in their workplace. The tense, fearful environment that had once lingered under the surface had been replaced by something else: pride. Pride in being part of something that had defied the odds, that had refused to compromise its principles. In celebration of the milestone, the CEO called for an all-staff meeting in the main dining hall. As he stood before them, he looked out at a room full of faces, some old, some new. Some had doubted him at first, others had stood by his side through it all. But now, for the first time, they all shared the same belief: La Lumiere had changed for the better. "This isn't just a restaurant anymore," he told them. "It's proof that when we demand better, we can build something worth believing in. And what we've built here, what you've built, will last far beyond any of us." Applause filled the room, but beneath the appreciation, there was something unspoken, a feeling that lingered in the air. The CEO had done what he set out to do. And now, it was time for the next step. Later that evening, he called the new general manager into his office. She was sharp, capable, one of the first people who had embraced the changes rather than fought against them. She had seen what was wrong with the old system long before he arrived. And now, she was one of the reasons the new culture was thriving. She took a seat across from him, eyes expectant. "I have something to tell you," he said, exhaling slowly. "I've made a decision." She straightened. "What kind of decision?" He smiled faintly, though there was a weight behind it. "I've done my part here, but La Lumiere doesn't need me to carry it anymore. It needs leadership from within. Someone who understands not just where it was, but where it's going." Her expression shifted from surprise to realization. "You're stepping down." He nodded. "Not leaving, just moving on. There are other places, other restaurants, that are still stuck where we were. I want to help them. Make sure this kind of change isn't just something that happens once, in one place." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, she smiled. "That's a hell of a legacy," she said. He chuckled. "That's the idea." They shook hands. A passing of the torch, not with words, but with understanding. As he stepped out of the building for the last time as CEO, The city greeted him with its usual symphony, honking taxis, distant conversations, the hum of life moving forward. The restaurant was still alive behind him, the golden glow of its chandeliers spilling onto the sidewalk. And yet, for the first time, it didn't feel like something he had to protect anymore. It would stand on its own. A breeze swept through the streets, cool against his skin. He looked up at the skyline, where the last light of day was fading into the horizon. He had fought for justice. He had won, but the fight was never truly over. And as he walked away, there was only one thought in his mind. The next battle awaited. In the end, this story wasn't just about one restaurant, it was about standing up when it's easier to look away. True leadership isn't about power, it's about accountability. About making choices that don't just benefit the business, but the people within it. So, what would you have done in his place? Would you have spoken up or walked away? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and if you love stories that expose hidden truths, don't forget to subscribe to Undercover Truths. More eye-opening stories are coming your way soon.